Alright, so this was our second step. Let's move on to the third step, which is to set the session provider. Now, they're doing it in _app, which is the root file. You can call the main layout file in page route, but in app router we have a different file for that. We call it the layout.js, which is in the root directory. So this is the file that will run right before anything. This runs on the server. So how do we set up this thing? The thing is, this file actually ran on client, as much as I remember. Correct me if I'm wrong, but this ran on the client. But in the app router, this thing runs on the server. So the behavior kind of changed. And because this runs on the client, it was pretty straightforward to use the service session provider, like these provider hooks, directly into this without any problem, because now we have client components, server components. The behavior has kind of changed, so we have to follow a different approach to this. So let's do this. Let's set this whole thing up, but we have to do a few initial steps before we get onto it. What I'm going to do, I'm going to go into the source folder, and I'm going to create a new folder. We'll call it providers. Here, it doesn't matter, you can name this whatever you want. I'll just call it session provider, because I guess that justifies its name. So we're going to make this file, session provider.jsx, and in here, we're going to use this. Right? Now, because it's a client thing, so this thing is this component is actually a client component. The reason we made this file, because this is a client component, we have to put a use client here, because this runs on the client, right? So we made a new file, we set it to be a use client, and then we're just gonna export it. The thing is, we can't call this use client because this runs on the server. It will just break the Next.js. Instead, we're gonna create a new file. We're gonna call it a client component, and then we're gonna just export that thing. Now, Next will render it on the client, because this runs on the client actually. So that is the first step. There we go. Now we just import our session provider. There we go. Oh, now note that we're not gonna import this session provider. Rather, we're gonna provide our own new session provider, which is session provider from @app/providers/ session provider. There we go. We're going to use this session provider. This is the brand new file that we just created. There it is. Okay. So we're going to say session provider. We're going to use the session provider. So why do we use this though? The main question is, why do we use this session provider? This will be used on the client because, you know, in your application, in your web app, you need to have access to the current user session on both client and the server. Now this provider will give access to the session on the client side, right? But the thing is, we don't know what session is at the moment because we haven't given it the current session. So how do we give it the session? We're going to give it the session just right now. But as you know, we don't have the normal behavior of just fetching the session from the props. So we have to do a little bit of different way of, we have to approach it differently. So this will stay the same. So we're going to give it a session variable, which we're going to be defining just now. So we're going to say const session, and let's make this asynchronous. Now this runs on the server, so we don't really have to worry it being a asynchronous or synchronous component. It doesn't really matter. This will run on the server. So in the session, now we're going to be using a hook that is provided by the next.auth, a function that will give us the current session from the server. We're going to say get server session. There we go. and we're gonna pass it into the service session provider. Now we have the current session. Perfect. Let's test it out. Does this work? Does this code work? Let's test it out. Let's try to use it. So we're gonna go into the page and let's take a look onto our client API. A client API, we have a method called getSession, which runs on the client for fetching the session. There's actually another one that is the useSession that we'll be using. The useSession is the one that we want to use because that's why we set up the whole session provider. So if you want to read the value of this, like what's inside of this, you're going to be using the useSession hook that is right here. So let's test it out. We're gonna go over to our home page. Now this is a server component at the moment, and you will see why. Because when I use useSession and I say useSession hook, I try to use the useSession hook here, which is not, it doesn't say anything at the moment, but I will show you in a second. So when I use the useSession hook here, it will give me an error. It will say React context is unavailable in the server components. So yeah, we're gonna use the useSession only in a client component. So let's do that. I'm gonna say use client, and everything works. Currently we can't see it. Let me change this to json.stringify session. As you can see, the current session shows up. Now, currently it's null. There's nothing in our session. That's how it should be. Alright, so we did all that to use this hook. So all the front end side, this whole thing was done to use that particular hook. Okay, that is perfect. Now let's try to set up a login thing. And let's take a look. So for that, we're gonna be needing the GitHub, like they have already done it, but we need to provide them the actual things. So let's set up a GitHub .env, and let me copy the keys that they're using in here. It is GitHub ID, GitHub secret, and for this, you're gonna go over to your GitHub account. I'm pretty sure this is pretty straightforward method of setting up an auth application. So you're gonna go down into profile, then developer settings, in the OAuth apps, new auth app. We'll just call it next-auth 13. Now it will say homepage URL. We just copy this, and we'll just remove this. And authorization callback URL. Now here, what you're gonna do, this part is important. In here, you're gonna say slash API slash auth slash callback slash GitHub. Now this is a thing that is provided in our REST API. They have shown us like how do you set the callbacks. So it's API slash auth slash callback slash provider. So in our case, we're using GitHub, so it will be GitHub. If you're using Discord, then it will be Discord. So we gotta set that, and I'm pretty sure everything is done. We're gonna register the application. We're gonna copy the client ID. We're gonna paste it right here. Then we're gonna generate a client secret. Okay, so we generated the secret. We're gonna copy the secret. We're gonna paste it here. There we go. Now we can close off GitHub. There we go. Now, by default, we have a sign-in page. How do we get that sign-in page? It's to go to slash API auth slash sign-in. So when I go to this page, we will see that the sign-in button works. It will pop up. We're going to sign in. It's going to tell me to authorize. I'm going to authorize myself. And now we're logged in. Now, remember, last time Then when we set it up, our session was null and unauthenticated. But now if I go to page, you're gonna see, oh, not the page, actually the home route. You're gonna actually see that my data is popping up, which is great. This is what we want to do, right? We got our session from the backend. So like that's the main thing for the first video I want to show. In the next video, we're going to be setting an adapter with MySQL, MongoDB. We're going to be checking out how we can set that. And yeah,